Welcome to the Caffeine Stream on Caffeine and Philosophy.
All right, we're back. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Caffeine Stream. My name is CB Robertson. This is episode 32. It's been a minute. And today we're going to be talking about, we've done a few contemporary philosophers. We've done Vox Day. We've done Matthew Crawford. We've talked a little bit about Curtis Yarvin. And today I want to talk with someone who is not I don't think I would call a philosopher, but who deals with philosophy and is certainly a commendable public intellectual, and that is James Lindsay. Now, when I say James Lindsay is not a philosopher, I don't mean that to denigrate him at all. I admire him tremendously. I'm trying to be technically accurate. He's more of a philosophical excavator or archaeologist of some kind. He's a discoverer. But he's also an attack dog. And I wanted to, before I delve into James Lindsay's work, I wanted to by way of introduction, talk a little bit about the value of having philosophical attack dogs. There is this idea in, especially the kind of new agey leaning side, you see it a lot on social media, of so-called spiritual people who are against anything that is negative. They're against negativity. They want everything, they just want positive vibes and to just be positive all the time. This is absolute and utter bullshit. The people who are against negativity have no meaningful positive attachments to things, because the positive things in this world are in conflict with each other. It's not like there's a conspiracy to attack the good. I'm not a Christian in that regard, although there are forces that look a lot like what Christians would call, the demonic or satanic. So there's kind of a crossover, but like the various standards for good are in competition with each other on their own, and the things that we love come under attack. Moreover, that aside, there are just bad ideas. Within a given standard, there might be things that fall short, that are just bad, whether those are bad economic models, whether those are bad ideas about morality, about religion, about science, bad takes on literature, bad ideas of how to treat your spouse or other people in general. It is valuable to criticize bad ideas. And especially in today's day and age where, everyone is talking about cancel culture, I think it can be very easy for people to conflate and to confuse criticism with cancellation. This is something that leftists will often gaslight conservatives about. They'll say, oh, you can't expect to say these things without consequences, as if having your bank accounts pulled and having your job pressured to fire you is identical with criticism in an intellectual context. There's a very dishonest thing that we're exposed to, but it can be very easy to forget that there is a difference between those two things, and that criticism and testing things is actually can be very valuable in exploring and discovering what is good. In recent months, I've been trying to find a way to criticize Scott Adams, the Dilbert cartoonist, who is also something of a philosopher, and I mean that quite seriously. And in my hunt to find things to criticize him on, first of all, I did find some things to criticize him on. I don't agree with him on a lot of things, but the hunting down of that sort of revealed how much good he's actually doing. And that he really is, I think, a net positive source and a very valuable guide for how to think about things a little differently and how to make decisions. Definitely not a go-to person I would recommend on issues of marriage, to bring just one example. And there are criticisms you can make of his view on simulation theory, which is actually the simulation hypothesis, a conversation for another time. But overall, the poking around to find weaknesses can reveal strength, so long as you're even keeled about it and just in your own mind about it. Attacking things is how we defend what we care about when the things that we care about are under attack. And when we're talking about James Lindsay, who is a philosophical attack dog, you can't expose yourself to the work of James Lindsay without simultaneously exposing yourself to the just how much of the good parts of our world are under attack. And so anybody who would be going after James Lindsay for, negativity and too much, causing trouble and all that is sort of giving up by default all of the good things that are under attack by people who are very good at pretending that they're just trying to create, that are pretending to just want the best. They are like Patrick Bateman in American Psycho. Oh, come on, Bryce. There are more important things than Sri Lanka we need to worry about. We need to worry about feeding the homeless and promoting social justice and equal rights for women, while also promoting a return to traditional moral values and less material, or whatever. It's a great speech of an absolute psychopath mouthing all of the mutually incompatible virtue signal phrases of the 90s with a almost deadpan face, but is more of a Justin Trudeau smirk going on. So, anyways, that aside, the fake positivity is often a veneer for truly malicious sociopathy. And so I think it's important that people get over this kind of naive aversion to excessive negativity. Now, I'm not saying there isn't such thing as excessive negativity. It takes discernment to understand if someone is just resentful, which is part of the problem James Lindsay deals with Marxism, and they just want to attack things for the sake of attacking things, or if they're criticizing things out of some principled defense of the good. The first intellectual hero I had, and someone I would recommend everyone go back and listen to debates and speeches from, was Christopher Hitchens. Christopher Hitchens was another philosophical attack dog, very much from the left, but didn't hold his punches on the left. He went after Bill Clinton, as well as Henry Kissinger and Mother Teresa and God. And I think one of the more interesting philosophical attack dogs on the right currently, who I've already talked about is in another podcast, is Vox Day. Vox Day has gone after Sam Harris, among the rest of the new atheists, including Christopher Hitchens, interestingly, and Jordan Peterson, as well as, perhaps most importantly, the whole sci-fi community. It's a very interesting and funny story, but with good reason. There is things to attack there. Some really dark and nasty stuff, it turns out. And to add to this list, I give you James Lindsay. So who is James Lindsay? Well, James Lindsay is a mathematician turned activist of a kind. I don't like using the term activist. It's technically correct, but it gives the wrong connotation. We could equally say educator, I suppose. James Lindsay is a classical liberal, which is not to be confused with liberal in the colloquial sense. This is someone who, holds strong to the values of, John Locke and the Constitution, the what he would say are the good parts of the Enlightenment. But he really rose into public prominence through a bit of drama that was called the Greivance Studies Affair. Lindsay, along with a couple of colleagues, including Peter Boghossian and Hannah Pluckrose, I might be misremembering that, wrote and submitted a number of completely garbage, fake academic papers to a number of journals. And they wrote them in a way that appealed to the progressive Marxist biases of the journals, but they were absolute nonsense. They were the one that eventually got published was, I think, one that James Lindsay wrote, or at least co-wrote, called "The Conceptual Penis as a Social Construct." Argued that penises aren't actually, I don't know, did it say aren't real? It was just gobbledygook, basically, but it sounded very very fancy leftist progressive sociology type stuff, and they published it. I don't remember which journal did publish it, but it was very similar to it was compared to the Sokal affair of back in the 1996, I want to say. Another fake paper that basically these fake papers are designed to test the rigor of the peer review process. And in this case, the peer review process failed dramatically. And James Lindsay tells stories of other papers that he helped write, including one where they took a chapter of Mein Kampf and just changed a few words, like they changed Jews to like whites or something like that. And they got some astonishing rejection letters, like responses that were like, this isn't bad, but you're neglecting to include the research of so-and-so author who's already covered this kind of material. Completely unaware that they're dealing with repurposed, literal verbatim Nazi phrasing, but just insinuated into the progressive argument. So total nonsense, and this caused quite a stir in the academic world. It actually disillusioned a fair number of academics who were like, oh gosh, this says some really bad things about our peer review system, and they're of course correct. It does. It shows that there has been an ideological infiltration that has been corrupting the rigorous standards of academic publishing. So that's how he got into the public eye. But why would he have done that? Why would he have done this thing, other than just to test the system as sort of a white hat hacker to maintain the strength of the system? Well, he started the Greivance affair because he, along with every person with a 3-digit IQ who has been to a university recently, has noticed that there has been a serious ideological incursion and corruption of academia, of the institutions of higher learning, and, as it turns out, a whole lot of other institutions beyond that. So after the Greivance study, which was motivated by wanting to push back on this, and then just seeing how far the rabbit hole went, in part through some of these quite terrifying rejection letters that were more encouraging than discouraging, he started to do some exploration. He started the New Discourses channel, which is, I think, a podcast, a YouTube channel. YouTube is where I get it, and probably a website and a few other things. And he's written a few books, but he's basically been exploring, where did all this wokeness come from? And what is wokeness anyways? And why is it all taking over everything now? And so, if most people are familiar with Karl Marx, but very few people are particularly familiar with someone like Georg Hegel. They might have heard the name, but don't really know much beyond that. Fewer, though more now, because of Andrew Breitbart, who did a similar kind of scam affair to expose fraud with the New York Times in starting the Huffington Post, along with Arianna Huffington. Fewer people know who Herbert Marcuse is. Now they do, but not so much before. And fewer still know the names of people like Paulo Freire, Kimberle Crenshaw, Gayle Rubin, John Fetzer, or Alison Bailey. These are all names that you kind of have to have a working understanding of in order to understand some of the strange things that are going on in our country now. Why do we have Drag Queen Story Hour? Why are transsexuals, who are a vanishingly minuscule subsection of the population, suddenly like the most important victim group in the United States? Why is that? Why did most public schools adopt an entire new pedagogical system within like 10 years after decades and decades of John Dewey, and then adopt a whole new system that's sort of tangentially related to that just like a few years later after that? That's something you probably won't understand if you don't know who Paulo Freire or John Fetzer, or who they are, or who the Castle organization is. So there's tremendous value in understanding why the world is changing in the way that it's changing, that is not just difficult to find, but that is actively hidden. Like, for example, if you go to the Wikipedia page for social emotional learning, which is now in most public schools and many private schools as well in the United States, it will not mention anything about John Fetzer. If you look at the curricula of public schools today, it will, most of them employ Paulo Freire's pedagogy of the oppressed. It's the second most cited work in all of academic literature in the social sciences. And most people don't know who he is. And yet it's being taught, not taught, like the theory isn't being taught, but it's being implemented in the teaching of your children. If you have kids who go to public school, might be valuable to know that. And, as James Lindsay is fond of saying, your kids go to Paulo Freire schools, but we live in Herbert Marcuse's world. If you don't understand Herbert Marcuse and his idea that James Lindsay is fond of bringing up of the biological foundation for socialism, that influences so much of the rest of the education pushes we've seen in the last 30 years. Things will be mysterious, but if you understand these things, they're less so. And understanding who these people are and what they contribute gives you some firepower if you feel like pushing back. So I will try to go through these names and explain briefly who they are, but the purpose of this little podcast is I hope to be something of a stepping stone. I'll try to give a summary of the worldview, but mostly to encourage you to go out and listen to James Lindsay's lectures yourself, because there isn't really a shortcut to this kind of understanding. I can give you summaries, but if you are a critical thinker, which you should be, you won't believe me. You won't believe the points I'm making, and you shouldn't believe the points I'm making until you see the goods yourself, until you see the proof, until you see, no, these people actually are this crazy. Herbert Marcuse in his idea of a new biological foundation for socialism, the argument he's making is almost too terrifying to believe that someone would actually make that until you actually read it in his words. So I'll start from the top and kind of work down. Everyone knows Karl Marx. I won't bother going over him. But before Marx, the foundation for Marxism and for everything that came after that, as well as the foundation for fascism, which they don't make that connection very often, is Georg Hegel. Now, Georg Hegel, I don't think was a bad person, in the way that Karl Marx was, and I don't think James Lindsay believes that either. But James Lindsay argues that he made some bad ideas that were useful to other people later. It gave people the power, the rhetorical tools to make a thing synonymous with the opposite of a thing. If there were only one lecture you were to listen to by James Lindsay, it would be his Hegel lecture, specifically the Hegel Wokeness and the Dialectical Faith of Leftism. And I'll leave a link in the description to that lecture. It's a long lecture. It's about 3 hours. And it's very worth your time to grasp that, because it makes the case that what Hegel is doing is, it is philosophy, but it's not just philosophy. It is also establishing a theology. Hegel's view of the world was that consciousness is like the ultimate good, and that there is a trajectory to history itself, and the culmination, the end point of history, is of the universe becoming conscious of itself as its own creator, and mankind being an agent to that purpose. And all of Marxism can be understood in this lens, and you won't understand Marxism if you don't understand this Hegelian theology, this deification of consciousness, and also the dialectical process by which history moves toward this inevitable end of self-consciousness and self-creation. So that's Hegel, and Hegel is the culmination, really, of what is known in the philosophy world as German idealism. You have Kant in there. You have a few other people. I would argue that stems from Socratic and ultimately Homeric idealism, but Homer's a little bit more complicated and balanced than just that. Hegel's like, no, it's just the ideal. So then you get Marx, who famously flips Hegel on its head and says, no, it's not about the spirit, it's not about the idea, it's about the material reality. And he takes that same dialectical process that Hegel talked about, where instead of I don't remember the exactly, but basically, I'm oversimplifying here, but you have the world as it is, the thesis, generates its own antithesis, generates its own negation. So you have some idea, and in reaction to the existing idea, some oppositional force arises. And the conflict between these two forces, the thesis and the antithesis, generates a synthesis, some combination or victory, perhaps most likely a combination, and a new state, a new status quo, which then continues the process. And Hegel believed this process was, at least to some degree, a predictable process. You could see a direction, and you could see a logical endpoint to this process. And Marx agreed, but thought that the culmination is not some idea, this consciousness, but a material state. And he used economic terms to make this argument, but as James Lindsay points out, Marx was not an economist. Economics was just a rhetorical tool to follow this Hegelian dialectic religion. It really is a theology where there is a concept of God, except it's a Gnostic idea. And James Lindsay goes into great details in explanation about what Gnosticism is, what Hermeticism is, alchemy, in other words. Hegel was very much an alchemist. And alchemy is not like primitive chemistry, although alchemists did like chemistry type stuff sometimes. It was very much a philosophical endeavor, and alchemy was about transforming lead in the metaphorical sense into gold in the metaphorical sense. How can you change mankind and as Marx would say, revolve around what was his phrasing? Man is to become the sun and revolve around himself. Something to that effect. very much to become his own god. So that's the Hegel and Marx, and that's really the foundation for the other stuff that follows. The ideal of super consciousness and self-creation, and also the dialectical process. Now, Marcuse is really the next serious person, and that's a fair while after Marx. James Lindsay also talks about Lysenko. He talks about Antonio Gramsci, but Marcuse is the next major figure of focus. Now, I'm vaguely familiar with some of the other Frankfurt School thinkers. Theodor Adorno, Max Horkheimer actually had some interesting thoughts of their own that are worth contemplating, in my own opinion. Marcuse does not. Marcuse is just an asshole, to put it bluntly and crassly. He's the most sensational, but he was also the most useful, and he wasn't dumb. He worked for the OSS, was an intelligence officer for the United States after he moved to the United States from Germany. And, his big contribution to academia was, at the time, there was kind of a crisis in Marxism in the late 50s and early 60s, because they were forced to recognize that capitalism actually worked, that Marx's economic predictions, which were not predictions but magic spells, attempted self-fulfilling prophecies that just didn't quite turn things over, were incorrect. That capitalism actually did work and provided a better life for people who lived under it, rather than just degrading them. And so Marcuse said, well, that's actually a problem. People's happiness is a very superficial thing. It's a very one-dimensional thing. And it's part of a flattening of the world. And their happiness with just material wealth and stuff is actually an impediment to true freedom and to higher levels of consciousness. So in a perfect is the enemy of the good maneuver, says, well, this good thing is actually bad, because it impedes the process towards the perfect. This is why Andrew Breitbart famously said, the Frankfurt School people were very upset that Americans were too happy. And so, he was dealing with this crisis of Marxism, which the Frankfurt School didn't actually see through. In fact, many of the other Frankfurt School members were quite pessimistic. They thought that, perhaps like the ideals were still good, that like true consciousness and freedom in the Hegelian sense was something to pursue, and they're still talking in dialectic. The great work to come out of the Frankfurt School was one that Adorno and Horkheimer worked on together, called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And it was a supremely pessimistic book that said basically, there's no way to envision the perfect state even. So all you can do is criticize the existing world and hope that the higher states, the progress of history will sort of spontaneously emerge from the void that we create through negation. Creation by negation is an alchemical principle that James Lindsay talks about at length. And again, if this sounds ridiculous to you, if this sounds like Jungian gobbledygook, it should. It should sound like that. I am not asking you to believe me, because I would not have believed this had I not listened to almost every single lecture James Lindsay has on his channel. And he goes into great lengths to demonstrate this is actually what these people believe and what they are trying to accomplish. So Marcuse's great contribution, and by great, of course, we mean terrifying, is this idea of a biological foundation for socialism. He had lots of contributions, but this is one of the more understated and more profound ones that has influenced later educational moves in the United States. And what he said was, the problem is that people are comfortable with capitalism, and it makes us too comfortable, in fact. So we need to create a new sensibility, we need to ingrain a kind of moral sense in people. When he said biological foundation, he didn't mean literally biology. So it's kind of a strange phrasing. But he means to change people, essentially. To change their very essence and their spirit such that the existing capitalist order becomes intolerable to them. The other way of phrasing that, of course, is we need to make them dysfunctional in the existing status quo so that they will feel compelled to rebel against it. That may sound like a cynical reading of this. I assure you, it is not. I would have thought this was straw manning had I not heard how this was advanced and progressed through other thinkers in the progressive movement in the 80s and the 90s and to the present day. So that's Marcuse. After Marcuse, James Lindsay introduces the world, really, outside of academia, to Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is a very interesting character. He was a Brazilian teacher. He taught people to read. That was the sort of superficial nature of his job. But when you read his books, notably The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, as well as a few others, what is surprising and what will be baffling to people who don't have that Hegelian framework for understanding all this other stuff is that Paulo Freire is first and foremost a religious figure. He is not just a teacher. He is not even primarily a philosopher of education. He goes on about the true Easter of the death and rebirth, dying in the privileged among the oppressor class and being reborn among the oppressed. And his whole program of teaching literacy, the mechanism of how it works is to he used what was called generative principles. The idea is, I don't want to teach people see spot run spot run, Jane sees spot run, this kind of rote learning that's this sort of straw man punching bag of every education philosopher since John Dewey. He called that the banking model of education, because it's just students deposit information and then the students can give it back like it's just a bank. It's like a really bad argument by metaphor. But he said the problem with that is that students just aren't interested in that material. They have more pressing things in their real lives that they care about. So he would interview students and talk with them about like what was going on in their life and blah, blah, blah. And he would find concepts, generative themes that were of interest. And he would begin his teaching of how to read with words that were maybe above what the students should be practicing in difficulty, but were pertinent to their lives. And how this actually worked out was that it became an excuse to very sneakily work in politically charged words. So he talked to all these students, and more or less, no matter what they said, the words he would begin by teaching them were things like slums, oppression, favela, slavery, and words that would draw, like a hypnotist, draw the students' minds to dynamics of victimhood and fairness and indignation, rather than on learning the alphabet and how to spell and grammar and those kinds of things. And his justification for this is that I'm not, at the end of the day, teaching them to read is actually kind of secondary. What we really want is not necessarily literacy, although that's also good, but cultural literacy. We want to teach them the tools for power of narrative building and so forth. And the justification is that if you learn these things, if you learn engagement in politics and society, then they will be motivated on their own to learn to read and stuff. Empirically, this is not what actually plays out. What plays out is that these students have nervous breakdowns and turn on each other and on the teacher, even, as we saw. But this is exactly how Mao's Cultural Revolution went down. Not that they were using Paulo Freire's technique exactly, because Mao's revolution preceded Paulo Freire by several decades, but similar principles at work. And there are cases of this being tested out in Africa and just failing abysmally. So, but that's who has been massively influential in the United States, especially since the 90s. His methods have been picked up and implemented in most public school systems in the United States and Canada within the last 3 decades or so. And most people don't know that or who he is or what he was about, what the generative themes are and so forth. So that's Paulo Freire. Moving on, who is Kimberle Crenshaw? Kimberle Crenshaw, as James Lindsay points out, is the forger of the one ring of power in progressive academia, and that is the idea of intersectionality. One ring to rule them all, one ring to find them, one ring to bring them all, and in the darkness bind them. That's what intersectionality does. It's the intellectual framework that draws, anti-black racism and Amerindian complaints about colonialism and feminism and every other kind of oppression narrative into one overarching schema, and simultaneously creates coalitions, but a very amorphous kind of mode of speaking that can be used to attack basically anything, and can create new victim groups as well. It's kind of a complicated subject that I can't get into too much here, but you learn who Kimberle Crenshaw is through James Lindsay's lectures, and it's hard to make sense of intersectionality and the way that people talk about racism and sexism and so forth without an understanding of Kimberle Crenshaw's work. Similarly, and somewhat related, it will be hard to understand queer theory and the other gender study stuff without understanding who Gayle Rubin is. Gayle Rubin is essentially, I don't know if she's exactly the creator of queer theory. She's not the creator per se. She's one of the main, proselytizers and intellectuals who has promoted queer theory. Now, queer theory, to put it briefly, queer theory is not just a sexual identity. That is currently how it manifests. But what queerness is, as it's described academically, is the rejection of the concept of normalcy. And this is the nuclear option with Marxism. Marxism can be summarized as a narrative where there's a special class of people who have a special kind of property that sets them as oppressors over the rest of society. And so we have to seize the means of production of that special property in order to pursue real equality. So orthodox Marxism, so like Marx's Marxism, is actually not best understood as Marxism unhyphenated. Orthodox Marxism is best understood as economic Marxism. You can make the Marxist argument, though, there's a special kind of property that some people have that they use to oppress others, and so forth. That can be applied to race, and then you have race Marxism, which is different than economic Marxism or class Marxism. What we have with Kimberle Crenshaw and like basically all the feminists is, gender Marxism or sex Marxism, which are supposedly not exactly the same, but they basically are. But with Gayle Rubin and queerness, it goes from something discrete and something specific to nuclear. It's everything. It's anything normal is a special kind of property. It's not whiteness. It's not maleness. It's not, capital. It's not, whatever. It's just anything normal is a special kind of property that normal people, so-called, use to dominate queer or odd or non-standard, abnormal people. You might have heard the phrase neurotypical, or I don't remember what the opposite of that is. Neuroatypical? Aneurotypical? I'm not sure how that would go. That feels like a segue into queer stuff, or a sneakier and more well-designed phrase that might have come out of queer theory. That's just speculation on my part. But that's what queer theory is, and you won't know that if you aren't familiar with Gayle Rubin and her work. And finally, as far as the details of these kinds of, or not the details, the overarching summaries of these sorts of things, Paulo Freire has been, I don't know if surpassed or overshadowed or replaced with or built on top of, been replaced with, I suppose, a new educational model that has swept into schools very rapidly in the last decade. And that's called social emotional learning, or SEL. This is, as with Freire, not something you're going to understand completely unless you understand the religious roots of the founders. Now, unlike Freire, the originator of social emotional learning, who I believe, if I'm remembering this correctly, is John Fetzer, is not exactly a Hegelian or a Marxist. He is a New Ager. So this is a new paganism that I would distinguish from classical pagan, which is sort of where I would place myself. I'm not in the Wicca world, but more in the world of Homer. And the New Age, like, what does the word New Age, the phrase New Age mean? Well, it's an idea that we've moved epochs. We're in a new age where things aren't like how they were before. So we need a new way of being. We need a new religiosity. We need a new sensibility, perhaps. And it's this idea that we need to remake ourselves in this new age that we have found ourselves in, a new age of consciousness and relation to each other and so forth. It's a very, one might say, optimistic, but also it's very, New Age is very, it rejects the past. It says the past is outmoded and we need to build something new. And so we get things like Wicca and Thelema and new sort of Gaia worship spirituality. I'll go down to Brazil and smoke some ayahuasca or whatever. It's very much trying to create something new. So it's sort of compatible with the Hegelian Marxist view, even if it doesn't have exactly the same roots. Now, John Fetzer was a big fan of Alison Bailey. Alison Bailey is one of the bigger names in the New Age spiritual movement. I don't know if she was actually into Wicca or Thelema herself, but she wrote very much in that direction, and John Fetzer was a big fan of that, and he very much implemented many of those ideas into his program, which became social emotional learning. Now, what is social emotional learning? It sounds very reasonable, doesn't it? It says, well, students, becoming educated people, ex ducara, out of childhood, becoming adults, is not just about learning knowledge. It's also about becoming socially adapted and emotionally adapted to, the world. Because, children are not necessarily the most emotionally controlled or socially normalized. The question snuck in there, of course, is adapted to which world? The world of the past? Or the new world in this new epoch that we have convinced ourselves by some esoteric gobbledygook that we are now living in? As the New Age foundations of John Fetzer and Alison Bailey would imply, it's the latter. And this is not exactly the same worldview as Herbert Marcuse, who is trying to create the new world by changing man first. But they're compatible, and they're working in tandem towards this future. And these are, again, things that you wouldn't know without delving into this kind of stuff and listening to James Lindsay. So again, I urge everyone to go and listen to this stuff, especially if you have kids in public school. It gives you this kind of knowledge is not just an understanding of what's happening and why, but also gives you ammunition to fight back. Because one of the themes of James Lindsay's work, I would say that there's three important themes, actually. First is the importance of religion. It's best to start believing in myth and religion. You're in one. There is no escape from the reality of religion. And it was very interesting to watch James Lindsay, as I have in the last 2 years or so, go from being this extremely hardened atheist of the liberal school, sort of Christopher Hitchens kind of guy, into being someone who is working with Christians and trying to save Christians from Marxist infiltrations. Because yes, they already more or less took over the Catholic Church, and now they're coming for the Southern Baptists, among others. And I've myself have written about the mythic and religious foundations of science. But Marxism also is religion-based. There is no worldview on offer that doesn't have a religious foundation to it. And if you don't understand that religious and mythic foundation, there's a good chance you don't actually understand the worldview itself. And if you don't understand that worldview, you're not going to be able to embody it, if it's a good one, or to fight against it if you think it's bad, or to notice when a different worldview is infiltrating yours and subverting it, as the Catholics missed when the liberation theologists took over the Catholic Church in Latin America, and arguably when a Latin American priest became Pope. So it's important to know these things. The importance of religion is the first theme. But as I was talking about before, the second point is that you can't ignore these problems away. And this sort of dovetails with the introduction I gave here about the importance of having philosophical attack dogs. I'll do another Tolkien quote here. War is upon you. You can't avoid the conflict. The enemy is not just at your gate, but scaling the walls, and a few of them are already inside. Fighting, the choice is not to go to war or not to go to war. The choice is to fight back or to surrender. the tendrils of progressivism are already in our schools, they are in our courts, they are in our government, they are in our military, they're in our corporations, they're in our local community groups, in our churches, and even in our families. They have spread and planned and worked very diligently for decades to get to where they are, and their position in society reflects this. So, you can't just reject negativity and expect positivity to just flow your way. But the final takeaway from James Lindsay, to sort of counteract that maybe a little blackpilling sounding message, is that the enemy here, and I'm assuming anyone listening to this is probably averse to Marxism. It's hard to understand Marxism without coming to hate it. It is the worst of what Nietzsche called the tarantulas in Thus Spake Zarathustra. Jordan Peterson does a very great reading of it. I would recommend highly. They're the worst of that, but somehow even more malevolent. But the enemy is very fragile. I don't think James Lindsay thinks we're ever going to kill Marxism permanently. I mean, we might, but then like the same what I would call Thersitism, this kind of objective evil, resentment based, just corrosive energy, it'll pop up in some other form. But as it is now, it is not, for all of its reach, for all of its influence, and even for all of its power, it is not nearly so strong as it looks. And they know it. They know that they are not as strong. It's very interesting listening to his lectures on the World Economic Forum and their implementation of social emotional learning, which, as implemented in schools today, is largely a data mining operation. They need to gather as much data on students as possible. They do these things called heart math, where they attach biometric readers. They read heart rate and sweat and things like that off students as they're doing math problems, but really while they're doing lots of other things. And they're trying to get as much information about students as possible in order to make them perfectly predictable agents in the coming economic order. But their plan won't work if they can't get that data, and they know it. It can't work, and it's really easy to point out. Similarly, James Lindsay has pointed out the point of all of these trans drag queen story hours is they're trying to make a drag Floyd event. George Floyd was leveraged into the summer of love in 2020. All this violence, rioting in the streets, so on and so forth. They're trying to provoke that with Drag Queen Story Hour, where if you do nothing, they indoctrinate your kids, but if you push back too hard, they'll use your pushback as proof that you're a bad person and a fascist and so forth. And so people will say, well, how do I fight that? How do I deal with that? All you have to do is point out that that's what you're doing. Point out that that's what they're doing, I should say. Point out, why are you trying to provoke this? Why are you, look, there they go. They're trying to provoke a reaction again. They're trying to groom kids to provoke parents to overreact. Look at that. Look, they're doing it again. It disarms them. And it's really easy to do. And then, eventually, when some person does overreact and kill someone or attack them at a drag queen story hour, everyone will have been saying for years, oh yeah, they were trying to provoke that. Look, it happened. And that sort of fighting words doctrine idea kicks in, and it loses all of the power that they had hoped to gain from that provocation. The enemy is very fragile. It's not that hard to beat. And if we do manage to defeat the Marxists of our age, it will feel in retrospect like it wasn't even that difficult. But if we don't rise to fight it, then they will win by default, because they do have the will and they've been working at it very hard. So on that cheery note, I'll try to bring this to a close. I'll say, I'll close on this point. I have been asked over the last 2 to 3 years by more people than I can count, hey Chris, I've really wanted to get into philosophy. Where do I start? What should I read first? And my normal response is to say, well, start with Plato. You can't go wrong with Plato. Side note, I very strongly disagree with James Lindsay on his take on Plato. He takes the Karl Popper, Jonathan Rauch view, where Plato is being totally literal in the Republic and is actually like an idealist and a communist and a fascist and all this other stuff. Very strong disagreement, maybe a point for another podcast in the future. But in learning philosophy, sometimes contemporary discussions are better starting points. First of all, it's more directly relevant. It's, to your life and to what's going on. And then it becomes, as you dig deeper, you sort of are required to go back further and to dig into Plato and to dig into Nietzsche and to dig into some of these other esoteric writers. Maybe you pick up, Joseph de Maistre or Hamann or someone like that. Out of your curiosity that was spurned by contemporary events and their origins and the ideas that drive them. If you want to get into philosophy and you don't know where to start, James Lindsay is a very good place to start, because he's talking about things that are going on right now in our society and why. And I would also recommend, if you do listen to James Lindsay, that you find some Marxist sources to listen to as well. I found a Marxist podcast to listen to occasionally, the Chapo Trap House crew. They're actually quite funny. And I wanted to listen to see if the points that they make contradict James Lindsay's view. Is James Lindsay really representing Marxists accurately? In an informal kind of way. And as charismatic as the Chapo Trap House crew are, and they are worth listening to, they're actually quite insightful and knowledgeable on certain points, especially pertaining to the JFK assassination and some of the FBI's goings on in the last decade or so. I'm convinced James Lindsay is not wrong in his characterization of Marxists. They do talk about dialectic. They do talk about the science of history and so forth, along with many other things. So be mindful of hearing the other side when you explore these kinds of subjects. But James Lindsay himself does a very good job of fairness, I think. And he will say, and Marcuse does kind of have a point in this way, but it doesn't really apply in this context because blah, blah, blah. So if you are looking to get into philosophy, James Lindsay is a great place to start. And like I said before, if you were to only listen to one lecture on the entire New Discourses channel, it is worth your time to listen to the Hegel podcast. I have my own thoughts on Hegel that I wrote down in The Hero and the Man prior to coming across James Lindsay, talking about Hegel's view of history and his expansion of heroic idealism into an even broader context than what Socrates or Jesus did. But that's another discussion for another time, and I can't say, even with my familiarity, I still learned a ton about Hegel from James Lindsay, and I think you can too, and by extension, from learning about Hegel, you'll learn about our current world, you'll learn about Francis Fukuyama, and the Marxists, and the fascists, and the neoliberals, aka the neocons, and so forth. So, anyways, I think that about wraps it up. Hope you enjoyed. Congratulations for sticking it through, and hopefully you'll go on to listen to the tremendously long but tremendously worthwhile lectures that James Lindsay has to offer. Thanks so much for listening.